So, as you know, this chapter 21, is over the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to go through some causes, talk about some early tech advances, the impact, why didn't the Industrial Revolution happen elsewhere in the world. So this is going to kind of cover everything so that we can pick apart some of the more important aspects of the Industrial Revolution as we go, throughout the next couple of days. So this picture is pretty interesting because Manchester in England is actually considered the first industrial city ever in the world. And this picture is interesting because the artist shows kind of that old world versus new world coming together for the first time. You see the factories and the pollution butting right up against the forest that was there. In cities, because of the factory, because the Industrial Revolution grew so quickly that like city planning and things like that were just unheard of. And so you placed things as just kind of where they fell almost. So cool picture to get us started today. All right, these are some of the four of the causes of the Industrial Revolution. And so we're going to go through these bit by bit, and then we'll talk about these a little more in class, and then I may add a couple extras to it. But these are some of the four bigger ideas that you need. And so the first cause of the Industrial Revolution was population growth. And so this happens due to a couple of factors, things like more reliable food sources, which we'll talk about on the next point, earlier marriage and higher birth rates because of the food. Women were able to withstand birth, and babies were healthier to be able to withstand birth as well. So this allowed for the populations to really explode. And this happens really all over Europe, but specifically England and Wales saw the highest growth of population during this time. And so what this meant was that children accounted for a relatively high proportion of the total population. The growth, this growth also, you could add in there, contributed to the migration of people from the countryside to the cities, from Ireland to England, from Europe to the Americas. So you had kind of this population growth and population migration happening at a high rate during this time. The next point is the agricultural revolution. Now, early on in Unit 0, we talked about kind of the first agricultural revolution, if that's what you'd call it. It was pretty basic. People were tired of going and getting food, so they brought food to themselves. And so that meant growing crops for the first time. That meant instead of going and trying to hunt animals that could actively kill people, it was let's bring animals to us and domesticate them, if you will. But about 300 or 400 years ago, kind of within that time range, you have the second industrial revolution. And this is where people started applying some of the scientific principles that are being instituted in the world to agriculture. And so this looks at things like the ideas of crop rotation. So instead of planting a field over and over again until you completely deplete the soil, it's moving crops around so that the soil can replenish its nutrients so that they will grow higher yields of crops. It's also farmers realizing that they could raise cattle and different things for meat and milk, which also helps strengthen your body with the calcium and things like that. And so he's really just taking, again, these scientific principles and applying it to how do we get higher crop yields, how do we get more for each individual animal that we're raising. You also saw kind of this new approach to how farming took place, because before, one farmer may control a bunch of different plots of land, but he didn't farm that himself. He hired peasants to live on the land, grow crops or raise animals. They gave some of that to the overarching landowner, and then they kept some of it, and if they had any extras, they sold it or they bartered it. But because the new technology that was being implemented, landowners realized, look, I can cut out that middleman and make more for myself. And so that's exactly what they did. They kicked a ton of peasants off of their land in what was known as the enclosure movement. I would make sure you have that down, the enclosure movement. And so they applied new scientific farming methods, forced these tenants to really, and sharecroppers to find new work because they weren't going to be able to get it there. And so they migrated to cities and they added to the labor force. Next is trade and inventiveness. In Europe, you had an increasing demand for goods. This was met with increasing production in traditional ways through the addition of new craftspeople, existing workshops, things like that. The population growth increased agriculture activity as well, as we've talked about, and was accompanied by a growth in trade, and really not just a growth in trade, but a growth in fascination with technology and innovation. And so you had this push for how do we innovate literally everything in society. And so the fact that, especially in England, it's one great big port, if you will, they were able to get goods throughout the world and bring raw materials in. And then you also have kind of this relationship between Britain and the continental Europe. And so in the 18th century, Britain had a number of characteristics that helped explain them being first. These characteristics include economic growth, population growth. People were willing to put new ideas in practice. You had strong mining practices, metal industries. As we talked about, the world's largest merchant marine, relatively fluid social structure. Like, they had a lot of factors going for them, which made them the first country to industrialize. And really everybody else was just sitting there waiting to see how they did it and then learn from their mistakes. They also had a good water transportation within their country, a lot of rivers that they utilized, as well as they started building canals. The economies of continental Europe experienced similar expansion, but a lot of the other countries in Europe lacked markets and managing those markets because of constant warfare, particularly with Napoleon. And so that interrupted trade and innovation with new technologies, so they lacked behind. Eventually you see Belgium and then France jump into the industrial game. And Belgium is interesting because we don't think much about them now, but Belgium was a pretty important factor even into the age of imperialism leading up to World War I, when they controlled the Belgian Congo. And they were extremely ruthless when it came to controlling that territory. This is a map showing you guys the industrial areas as well as the exposed coal fields. Gives you a relationship. You see railroads that were being built, which we will come to here in just a little bit, because all of that is related. All right, so let's talk about some tech that was revolutionized during this time. One idea was mass production. Excuse me. One idea was mass production, and we're going to look at this through the idea of pottery. So any sort of like porcelain cups or tea glasses or anything like that, they were expensive to find, make, and so not many people had them except for the wealthy. And eventually this changes with a guy by the name of Josiah Wedgwood, which his name's right there. And so because of the increased demand for tea, cocoa, and coffee, Josiah Wedgwood in about 1759 opened a business in used division of labor and molds rather than using a potter's wheel to mass produce high quality porcelain. And what this did is when you have this huge influx of huge influx of porcelain being shoved in the market, it drives the prices down. It's that simple supply and demand approach. And so Josiah Wedgwood made kind of revolutionized business through his idea here, and a lot of other industries follow suit after this. You also have mechanization come into play, and this is where really you see it, or you think of it, hopefully, through the cotton industry. And because there was such a strong market for cotton cloth, but the plant did not grow in Europe, it was hard for Europeans, specifically Britain cotton factories, to find cheap cotton. And so around the 1760s, you saw some innovations revolutionize the spinning of cotton thread. And so you see the spinning jenny, which I'd looked that up at some point in 1764, the water frame in 1769, and the mule in 1785. I'd look those up and I'd understand what those are, kind of the basics of it. Don't get into too much depth, just the basics of it. But you had innovations being placed on the cotton industry so that it wasn't just one person taking cotton, turning it into thread, and then turning it into cloth. it became more of a factory business, a mechanization process. So it became a lot more efficient, which means there's a lot more of it, which means that also drove the prices down as well. America specifically kind of cashed in on this because you guys hopefully are well aware the southern states had cotton and quite a bit of it. And so they used that to help grow our country. You also have the rise of Eli Whitney and his machine, the cotton gin. As you guys know, the cotton gin, it's a simple machine that basically separated cotton from the seed and cotton from the stalk and things like that. It's what grew the American industry, which is a lot of historians now attribute to the growth of slavery in America as well. Next, you have the iron industry. So new techniques were placed to really make iron a little bit more efficient to make, which means cheaper, but also so that it withstands some of the new inventions that are being put in place. So things like bridges and eventually the steam engine and stuff like that. All of those things were needed. So good iron was needed for that. This helped also with iron and coal. The focus on that helped reduce the amount of trees that were being used for fuel, which was nice. It helped the environment a little bit, kind of a twofold, helped it a little bit, but also the pollution was bad. So, kind of both ways there. Now you see the first real use of iron, which in construction with the building of the Crystal Palace. I looked that up. And so you see that really put into play, and that's when people started taking notice. You also had the idea of interchangeable parts. This was also done by Eli Whitney as well. So this was widely adopted in firearms, farm equipment, and sewing machines. And what that meant was that instead of your plow breaking or one specific part of your plow breaking and having to get a whole new plow, you could just replace that single part, which that was revolutionary because now anybody could afford it. Imagine if you got a flat tire in your car and you had to buy a whole new car. It's the same thing there. Next is the steam engine. So there's two people that come into mind on the steam engine, and that's the two names you see there, Thomas Newcomen and James Watt. Now, Newcomen was the first one to make a steam engine, and his was very crude, it was inefficient, but it did its job of pumping water out of the coal mines, which meant more coal, which is what made Great Britain a powerhouse. Eventually, you see James Watt come in, and he takes Newcomen's engine, and he manufactures and creates this better system and starts putting it in place in other areas. And so you see people take it and use it for railroads, steamboats, and that type of thing. And the reason why this is revolutionary is because human power, animal power, even wind, even water, even though that was pretty revolutionary for its time, even water, all of those things were inefficient. They were not a good way to produce energy. People and animals get tired. Wind doesn't always blow, and water you have to fluctuate with the levels of the river. And so the steam engine allowed for one, them to put factories or whatever anywhere, but two, not have to rely on something that they couldn't control. And so again, in the 1780s, you see the steam engine used on riverboats in France and America. 1830s, you see these put on ocean-going steamships, which are on a much larger scale. And so it really changed the game. Next, you have railroads. So you have two people attributed to the rise of the railroad. These were inventors named Richard Trevithick, so T-R-E-V-I, Thick, and George Stephenson. They built these lighter but more powerful high-pressure steam engines and put them on locomotives. And so this soon replaced horse and horse-powered railways. And this allowed for, again, a more efficient way of moving goods. The railway building mania actually swept Britain from about 1825 to 1845. It's connected major cities and small towns. In the United States, the railway boom happens in the 1840s and 50s, really on into after the Civil War. And so you saw the Midwest being developed, and then you also saw the connection of the East and West, especially once they got the whole country in one. Now, these railways ended up helping spread the Industrial Revolution because you were able to move your product quicker and more efficient. Instead of a dirt road getting muddy and not being able to use it for 2 weeks, didn't matter. As long as the rails were set, you were able to go. And then the last thing is probably one of the more important moments of the Industrial Revolution, and that's the construction of a modern communication system with the electric telegraph. So you have Wheaton's and Cook's 5-needle telegraph in England, but then most of us know about Morris's dots and dashes in the United States. Both were revolutionary. In the 1840s and 50s, Americans and Europeans began building the beginnings of a global communications network. So what you see here is the world getting smaller, not physically, but now you are able to instantaneously contact people, really anywhere that there was a telegraph. And this launches us into, the telephone age, and then eventually the cell phone age, and then the internet age, and then the social media age. And so all of this is connected here, but this is the first time you really see that come down. Now, some of the impacts of the Industrial Revolution that you see is some new industrial cities. Some of these new industrial cities were good for people who ended up doing well in the manufacturing business. They were able to build wealthy homes, churches, public buildings, things like that. But if you were poor, if you were one of those people kicked off of the during the enclosure movement, you were kind of a grunt and you lived in some really cheap, terrible conditions. And so because of that and the sudden population growth, crowding, and you didn't have municipal services in the urban areas, so it really made things pretty terrible. Some examples of this is you didn't have facilities for sewage disposal, so where do you put your waste? Air and water pollution, diseases made life unhealthy. And so you see this change from people getting a little healthier to and babies being able to withstand birth to a higher infant mortality rate and a shorter life expectancy. Now, this just wasn't physical conditions. This was also because people were depressed, and you saw the suicide rates raise as well during this time. And eventually, people decided to make changes, and so you saw some reforms put into place that helped kind of make things better for those workers. Some rural environments. The Industrial Revolution kind of has it's kind of a mixed bag on how it affected the environment. In some places, you saw the lack of focus on forest and woods and things like that, those materials. So it helped them, but then the pollution from the factories made things a little less clean, and so. Again, it's kind of a mixed bag. Europeans did clear land for these factories. Again, you didn't have sewage systems, things like that, so things were dirty. But the further out you went, once really they hit their max in terms of a city, they didn't go out any further. So it did help that. Working conditions. If you were a skilled worker, like a carpenter, metal worker, machinist, things like that, you got paid well. But most of the jobs that were available were unskilled, repetitive, boring, badly paid, poor working conditions, caused the separation between home life. Women, for the first time, because of low wages, also had to go to work. And eventually, factory workers realized that, look, I don't have to pay women as much. And so because of that, a lot of factory workers or a lot of factory owners only hired women and kids. And so you saw a rise in women labor and as well as child labor, which kind of disrupted the home life for a lot of people. You saw child labor specifically in the mines, but really everywhere, even in the textile industry. In America, we started out giving women better working conditions and higher wages, but eventually that changed because they realized that, they can make more money, and there's no laws telling them they can't if they work them harder and work them longer. If women refuse these conditions, the factory owners would just fire them and hire Irish immigrants because they knew that they would work harder for the same pay. The Industrial Revolution increased the demand for cotton, sugar, coffee. It also helped prolong slavery in the United States and the Caribbean, as well as extend it to the coffee growing regions of Brazil. Some changes in society kind of changed how the economies ran, what people thought about the economies and stuff like that. It came up with the idea of the business cycle, was something I put down in your notes. And then the raising incomes allowed the middle class to be built. And so before you had upper class, lower class, but then that changes and now you have a middle class. All right, so getting through, you have some new economic ideas put in place. You have Adam Smith is a guy who came up with the idea of laissez-faire economics, which is essentially the government should refrain from being in business. Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo agreed with him. Now, they looked at the poverty of the working class not as an issue with the factory owners, but an issue of overpopulation, and said it should be addressed not by government action, but by these people delaying marriage and not having sex. That was their argument, which is insane. So business people welcome the idea of this. Now, some critics of laissez-faire were Jeremy Bentham in England and Friedrich List in Germany. And these two thought that the government should take action to manage these things. And then you see Marx down there, Karl Marx. We're going to talk about him more later, but he's the guy who came up with the idea that the working class eventually will rise up and take over the factory owners, and that they're going to create this kind of utopian society where everybody's working for everyone. And his idea, Karl Marx's idea, that is what launches the idea of communism, which we'll talk about a lot when we get to the Russian revolutions pre-World War I and even during World War I. Now, you eventually had people protesting working conditions, and so they engaged in riots and strikes and things like that. They would also change jobs a lot, which means they could have interrupted productivity when you had people just leave. They didn't report for work. They did poor quality of work. Strikes, riots, things like that. Eventually, people started combining and saying our voice can be heard collectively, and so you see things like trade unions develop out of this. Now, some reforms eventually happened with the British government, and so they wanted to investigate some of these abuses. And so you have the Factory Act of 1833, the Mines Act of 1844, and the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. I would look up those three. If you need to go back and hear the last two, make sure you do that. But I would look up those three and understand what they were, because things were changing because of the conditions. This is an interesting picture because you see the gaslighting being lit. Now, what this did, the major impact this had, is that crime went down instantly just because there was lights. Crime, murder, robbing, things like that went down dramatically in London and eventually the rest of Europe just because they added lights at night. All right, so let's talk about the rest of the world real quick and then we'll finish up. So the rest of the world outside of Europe and England, they were also trying to industrialize as well. In Egypt, Muhammad Ali, who was the ruler of Egypt, took this program of industrialization, was funded by the export of wheat and cotton, and they were protected by high tariffs on imported goods. The problem was Great Britain did not like Egypt becoming an industrial power, and so in 1839, they forced Muhammad to eliminate all import duties or tariffs. And so without that, the British goods ended up overcoming the Egyptian goods, and so they ended up making themselves, Britain ended up making themselves become important, and Egypt dependent on it. Same thing in India. So India was also a big cotton exporter to England. They started industrializing, but eventually Great Britain came in and got their hands on things and made sure that they did not, that they weren't able to fully industrialize. And so they basically got the raw material from India, took it back to England, created cloth, and then sent it to the rest of the world, specifically India, which made them dependent on them as well. And same thing in China. So because Europe, specifically Britain, industrialized first, it means they had more powerful weapons, so they easily defeated the Chinese in any conflict. And so because of that, but also the Chinese conservative elitist groups in the growing population of peasants. They were concerned mostly with agriculture rather than anything else. They decided to focus on that. And again, that's Britain forcing them to become dependent on them. And that's what Britain wanted. You know, you may knock Britain for forcing their hand, but they were also smart enough to make everybody become dependent on them. All right, so that's chapter 19's notes. If you have any questions, make sure you ask. I'll see you guys soon.